Zelensky's justification for rage. By complaining to his Western backers before arriving at the NATO conference in Vilnius, my old friend Rod Dreher thinks Volodymyr Zelensky is showing ingratitude and real chutzpah. But I disagree and think Zelensky has every reason to be angry and more. Diplomatic signals were flashing in the lead-up to the conference that indicated participants wanted a Bucharest Plus. They wanted more than just a reiteration of a promise made at the 2008 NATO summit that Georgia and Ukraine would join the alliance. Diplomats desired this because they are aware that Zelensky will need a message like this to sell to Ukrainians at home, especially given his current predicament of having to cancel elections. Zelensky's political survival hinges on his popularity and influence among Western allies in the absence of significant advances in the counteroffensive. Before his arrival, however, the prevailing terminology had already begun to resemble Bucharest minus. The West not only put additional, unstated conditions on Georgia and Ukraine's NATO membership, but also delayed the process indefinitely. According to The Washington Post, Vice President Biden has been more cautious than the leaders of many other NATO member countries in their support of Ukraine's bid, arguing that in addition to ending its war with Russia, Kyiv must also undertake internal reforms. Democracy and free markets are two ideas that NATO strongly supports. Perhaps correctly, Zelensky assumed that the White House and the West were holding Ukraine's NATO membership hostage in order to use it as leverage with Putin. This was abundantly clear as discussions of armed neutrality, or the Israel model, for Ukraine began among the diplomatic chattering class in Vilnius. Putting yourself in Zelensky's shoes, you should know that he was elected on the promise of putting an end to the conflict in eastern Ukraine, rebuilding the country's road system, and protecting Ukrainian politics from the influence of oligarchs. During Putin's first years in office, he and Zelensky were unable to find a common ground for ending that conflict. At the time, Zelensky's efforts were undermined by the Western press and diplomatic corps, who mocked him for acting like an amateur comic who got punched by Putin. Ukrainian paramilitary ultranationalists shared this view. When war broke out, Ukraine's political future became even more limited. Why is it that the West is suddenly demanding that Ukraine do better on measures of democracy and liberalism while talking about its neutrality? Putin has suggested a policy of neutrality for Ukraine. The West and the Kremlin agree on everything except whether Ukraine will be armed or disarmed. Russia views as non-neutral and a threat to its security a Ukraine that has been armed by NATO to be interoperable with NATO. The goal of Ukraine's military buildup was to ensure the country's continued freedom from Moscow's influence over its foreign policy. Ukraine's nationalist project of breaking away from Russia is, as I argued in a previous post, inherently illiberal and anti-democratic. Ukraine's resolve to join the West is likely to weaken if the government works to strengthen democracy there. The West has reasonable justifications for its actions. It does not want to escalate the conflict with Putin any further than it already has. Ukraine believes it has fulfilled all Western requirements. War has already wreaked havoc on it. As a result, NATO has done a favor for the alliance by weakening and discouraging Putin's military. And now the West wants a Western-aligned Ukraine, which will only deepen all the underlying issues that have contributed to Ukraine's destruction and deepen its internal political contradictions without offering a final resolution that could make sense of the current bloodshed. The West has effectively told Ukraine this week that it will probably never get its independence from Russia, despite the fact that Ukraine has paid the highest possible price to assert that independence.